In this demo, I will show you how to do a local Kubernetes setup using Minikube. This is the Kubernetes Minikube GitHub URL. You will find all the GitHub releases under releases right here. So here you can download manually the latest release of Minikube. They have versions for macOS, for Windows, and for Linux. The easiest way is to use a package manager. So if you go back to the Minikube main URL, then below you have README, and in this README you're going to find a getting started guide. Using this getting started guide, you can install Minikube for Linux, macOS, or Windows. And I would recommend you to follow this guide to install Minikube on your system, because the guide splits out different options, and depending on what OS and version of your OS you're running, you might have to go with a different option. So I'm going to show you this demo on macOS, and on macOS it's pretty straightforward, but if you're on Windows, I will just follow this guide to get it installed. So let's quickly go over the different options. Let's say that you're on Linux. You can just download and install Minikube in user local bin using this command. You would still have to install the command line utility kubectl, which you can download from the Kubernetes website. In my procedure document, you will find the URLs that you can use to download kubectl. So this is for Linux. Then for macOS, you have two options. You can use brew, which is the easiest way. It will automatically install the kubectl command line utility for you, or you can use direct, also using the curl command, and extract it in user local bin Minikube. And then you have the Windows option, and with Windows you can download the Minikube installer, which will install it for you, or you can use a package manager, the chocolatey package manager. If you don't have this yet, you can download this package manager from here and then run this command, and this will install Minikube for you. So the difficulty that will arise is that Minikube will start a VM to run Kubernetes in. So you cannot, and that is important, you cannot run Minikube within a VM. It will spin up a VM itself. That means that you will have to choose a hypervisor. So you on Windows and also on Mac, you have different hypervisors. So on Windows, you can either use Hyper-V or VirtualBox. And then using these commands here, you can see which hypervisor is installed on your system. So if you have a look here, for example, Hyper-V will only work on Windows 10 Enterprise, Pro, or Education. If you have the Home Edition, you will not be able to use Hyper-V, you should use VirtualBox. So then you download VirtualBox, and then you use Minikube start VM driver VirtualBox. And using this command, you can make it a default driver. So in general, Home Edition, VirtualBox, otherwise you can use Hyper-V, and with Hyper-V, you still might have to enable it as an administrator. So whether you will be able to run Minikube all depends on the hypervisor. If you have troubles launching Minikube, it will probably be a hypervisor issue. There are alternatives. You can use, for example, Docker for Windows, Docker for Mac, if you have issues starting Minikube. I would still recommend to try Minikube first, because it's such an easy way to get Kubernetes running on your system. So to summarize, getting started guide right here to install Minikube. And then if you're not using a package manager, download kubectl, install and set up kubectl for Linux or for Mac or for Windows. So for example, if you're on Windows, you can download the latest version from this link. I also have in my procedure document links to the kubectl version. If you already have Docker for Windows installed, then this will also have a kubectl version. Probably best to just type kubectl already in a PowerShell or a CMD on Windows to see if you have kubectl available. Make sure that if you download the latest version of Minikube, that you also have a new version of kubectl, which means if you already have a kubectl installed, you probably want to upgrade that one. Otherwise, you can get some errors when you're trying to connect to your cluster. So let's try to set Minikube up on my machine. So I will just use brew because that's the easiest. Brew install Minikube. So if you are macOS, it's going to be pretty easy to install Minikube. It will also install the kubectl for me. So we will have Minikube and the kubectl. Once this is done, and this command is exactly the same whether you are on Windows, Mac or Linux, you run Minikube start. And if you are on Windows, you might have to add the VM driver here. If you don't add the VM driver, it's going to automatically select one for you. So here it says automatically selected the HyperKit driver, and alternatives is VirtualBox. So for me, it's going to use a HyperKit, but I could also use VirtualBox. HyperKit is preferred over VirtualBox on Mac. So this is then going to set up HyperKit. So I need to give my root password of the machine. And then it's going to download the latest VM image. Now it's creating a new VM, and that's why we cannot run Minikube within our own VM. We need to run it on our host system. So if your host system is Windows, then you need to run it on your Windows machine because it will create a VM, a virtual machine itself. So all our Kubernetes processes will run in this VM that Minikube is creating. So now it is preparing Kubernetes 1.17.0 on Docker 19.035. So because we are using Kubernetes 1.17, you also want to make sure that your kubectl version is also on 1.17. So if I just open another window, kubectl version, and I can also see that my kubectl is version 1.17, 1.17.0. So this one will definitely be compatible with the Kubernetes that I'm running within Minikube. So then once it starts the VM, it's going to use kubeadm to set up my cluster. I also have at the end of this course some kubeadm lectures where we use kubeadm manually to set up Kubernetes on a couple of VMs within the cloud. So if you want to do it completely manual on a virtual machine, you can use kubeadm for that. Then it's pulling the images, launching Kubernetes, waiting for the cluster to come online, and now it is done. Minikube also says that it has configured kubectl to use Minikube. So that basically means that it created a config for us. Where is this config? It is in our home directory in .kube config. So Minikube set this up for us. It set up the certificate, the server. So now we can connect to this server using kubectl to execute Kubernetes commands. So let's have a look again at the documentation, which has some example commands that we can run to test whether our cluster is running. So here we have the link examples, Minikube start that we did. If you want, you can run a Minikube dashboard to see a dashboard. We're going to skip that for now. I have some lectures later on the dashboard. And then you can do kubectl create deployment, hello Minikube, which is going to create a deployment using the echo server image. It's just a test image to see whether it's working. And then we're going to expose the service as a node port. I will explain to you later on what node ports means. Now we're just going to copy paste these commands, see whether our cluster is working, and then later on I will explain in depth what this all means. Kubectl create deployment, hello Minikube. Deployment is created. So now it created a service so that I can reach my hello Minikube deployment. And because this is now all created in a Kubernetes within the cluster, I now also need to enter a command to know the IP address and the port where I can connect on to reach this service. So Minikube service hello Minikube. And this went pretty quick, but it actually opened a browser window and it immediately went to the correct URL. So let's have another look at the terminal first. So we have the namespace, default namespace, name hello Minikube, and then the URL that we have. So this is the node port that has been opened on this IP address of my virtual machine. So you see here server 192.168.64.8 on port 8443, which is a Kubernetes API server. Now it created another port. It opened another port, the node port, where then my service is reachable on. So then it says opening service default hello Minikube in a default browser. Then it opens within my browser this URL. And this is exactly what the Echo server is returning. The Echo server just returns some information about the request. So we have the client values, server values, and the headers received. There was nobody in the request. When you are finished with the lab and you want to stop Minikube, you can just run Minikube stop, and this will then stop the Minikube VM. If you did something wrong and you want to completely destroy your VM, you can use Minikube delete, and this will then delete the VM completely. And then when you then do Minikube start, it will start a new VM. You don't have to delete it all the time, only when something major went wrong and you cannot recover, or you completely finish with Minikube, you want to make sure that you don't have the VM installed anymore, then you can use Minikube delete to delete the cluster and delete the profile from your kube config. So that's it for Minikube. Minikube is a very powerful tool that you can use to test with Kubernetes and deploy on Kubernetes using your local machine. It might be a bit tricky to set up for the first time, especially on Windows, but once it is set up, it is pretty easy to use.